I thought that that was a great segue. Bethany and I did not plan that, but when she talked about how the key takeaway is put the consumer at the forefront of your development, that's obviously really important. If you make a great and compliant product, but the consumer doesn't like it, you're not going to sell a single one. So that is obviously the key, but it's a perfect tie-in because what I always say is you also need to be thinking about the rules and the regulations as you develop your product in order to reach your consumer, because the rules are going to dictate pretty much everything you do in this space, and they're going to vary market to market and over time. So if you have a plan to reach the video game consumer that Bethany was just talking about, you need to have a plan that's going to allow you to reach them in your launch market, in your expansion markets. It's not a one-off. And if you want to do that in an organic way, in a way that doesn't require you to junk your marketing halfway through to transition, that's what this is about. So that's my topic for today. It's key regulatory questions for cannabis beverages. We will see if I can work this. There we go. That's me. I run a company called MadisonJay Solutions. What we do is what I was just talking about. We help brands, both plant-touching, ancillaries, consumer brands, think about the regulatory questions that dictate so much of what you're going to do in this space, how you can sell, how you can develop your brand, how you can do this over time. My background was in white shoe regulatory law. I was the general counsel of a company that, for those of you who come out of beverage alcohol, you may well have worked with in the past. And we spun this company out a number of years ago to address this opportunity, these sets of questions that we were getting in adult use and hemp cannabinoid. And this subtitle is only on this slide. It was not on the first slide, so this is like a bonus subtitle, but I believe it's important, and it's how do you build for national scalability? There are people who are one market brands in this space, people who only want to be in their local market for whatever reason. By and large, I find the people in an audience like this tend not to be that, right? Now, it's still important to think ahead if you're going to be in one market because you want to be able to sell in that market under the current rules and under future rules and be competitive. But if you want to build for national scalability, if you want to build a brand that resonates with consumers today to get a head start and be ahead of where the federal rules are, you need to be thinking about what those federal rules might look like. So what's one subset of these questions? Formulation. How do you formulate your product? One big question, multi-serving versus single serve. When you were just looking, most of the products that Bethany had up, the pictures, I think, were single serves, right? Your seltzers, things like that. She alluded to the things that kind of look like a spirit bottle substitute that have a measuring strip, multiple servings, but that's going to be a business consideration, right? What are you selling? Is it something that is a multi-serving or a single serving? She was referring to it as beer. In many states, fun fact, you can't actually call it beer because it's non-alcoholic. You have to call it hop water or something like that. But that, to me, classic. I've never met anyone selling a multi-serving hop water in this space, the equivalent of a 40 of beer. It's just not at the top of people's minds. So there are some products that would always be a single serve, but there are markets, for example, Massachusetts, Connecticut's draft rules that don't permit multi-serving beverages. That obviously is going to create all sorts of considerations. If you're launching in a market, you have a multi-serving, and then you want it to go to those markets, right? Particularly a more potent product, right? The spirit substitute. There's a consumer expectation consideration there. For example, how much am I paying for this little teeny bottle, right? If you take your formulation that was sold in a big bottle at 100 milligrams per bottle, and then you just can only sell a single serve, you're selling somebody a little bottle, right? And consumers may not be happy with that. There's a continuity point, right? If your brand is about multi-serving, right? The equivalent of that barbecue, that's your target demo. You want to be the drink for coming together and doing fun things together. Probably that single serve limitation is going to be pretty significant to you as you're developing what the branding looks like, right? If your branding has been about sharing this bottle and coming together, some markets can't share the bottle. It's a single serve, it's a little guy. Now, that doesn't mean that a brand couldn't exist to do that, and I'm sure some of you are picturing a super cool RTD that you could come up with, but at the end of the day, it's going to be something that you're going to want to have thought of in advance, right? This is not going to be something that you want to be surprised by when you go to launch in Massachusetts. There are also regulatory concerns for that single-serve form factor that are particularly salient. This is one that sounds very dumb until you actually try to do it. Maybe some of you have. If it's a really little package, it still needs to have all of the regulatory information. Think about the warnings that you see on Illinois products. They're not short. So that may mean that you need to put an outer layer on the bottle. You need a bigger bottle that's not filled all the way, a box. You can imagine there starts to be cost of goods sold considerations depending on how much those things cost. Obviously, consumers aren't thrilled if you sell them a bottle that's 1/3 filled because you needed a bigger bottle in order to put all the regulatory information on it. But these are real decisions that people have to make when they were not fully thinking through what that extension looks like. And obviously nobody ever sells the 1/3 full bottle. That would look terrible on a shelf. I think that the key here, again, it's not that you can't do these things, but if you are a brand that has been all about drinking it neat, you drink this product neat in, say, California, you try to bring it to Massachusetts, it's going to be hard to explain to consumers why now it should be mixed, right? You want to have this built into the branding from launch. The second bullet, how potent is your product? Again, this is going to be primarily a business-driven consideration. You need to be thinking about your consumer like Bethany was talking about. You don't want to make this decision based on regulatory considerations. But it's also going to be dictated by regulatory considerations, both in how you formulate and where you want to take that product under the current rules. So let's say you launch in California, you launch here. That's 100 milligrams of THC per package, 10 per serving. In Massachusetts or Connecticut, the contrast states that I've chosen, that's 5 milligrams of THC per serving. If you have a non-beverage edible, you may be curious, it's 100 milligrams for those, but it's 5 milligrams per serving. So given that multi-serving beverages are prohibited, you're looking at a product that not only needs to change form factor if you sell a multi-serving, but you also need to make it potentially half as potent because you can't sell 10 milligrams of THC in a serving. You can only sell 5 milligrams of THC in a serving. That can impact your desire to expand to those markets, obviously. But it may also impact your formulation if you think that you have certain competitive advantages in the Northeast. You know, that could be a retailer distribution advantage. It could be a routes in the market advantage. There are many reasons why somebody might think, I'd like to be in these markets. If you want to be in those markets, it probably limits how you're going to formulate in your other markets, or at least how you're going to brand those, right? Maybe you say this is the extra potent version, the extra strength version in California, so that consumers don't get disappointed or confused as to why you're selling something that's half as strong in Massachusetts. What cannabinoids are you considering? Some brands are going to be built around a minor cannabinoid story. You're telling consumers they want X and you deliver X in the proper ratio. That's the normal way that you sell those. Now, a regulatory key, and this is like the bare minimum, is making sure that you have a lab in the state that can actually test and substantiate that, because you're going to want to have that on your COA. But to vastly overgeneralize here, those cannabinoids are often included because of a potential impact or a wellness benefit that they may confer. And though I'm going to touch on this more when I talk about branding, if you're asserting that a 3-to-1 ratio of X to Y has a unique desirability, that may turn into a specific benefit claim. And the benefit claim may need to be legally substantiated, which can be challenging with where the science is today. By the same token, you want to be careful about foreclosing an opportunity that you may want in the future. Right? The science is still evolving. You may learn that 3.5 is actually a better ratio than 3 to 1. You don't want to only be the 3 to 1 brand in that situation. So building in flexibility, being aware of where the science is, and though it's particularly important if you're making claims in your marketing, it's also important if you aren't. You just want to be out in front of these. You also want to be thinking about the form of your input. Again, this is a fast evolving space, and inputs for cannabinoids that may not have existed 5 years ago are suddenly very buzzy. They're important to consumers. So what does that mean for you? It means being mindful of how you describe your ingredients. So in Illinois, you have to disclose solvents. That may change your plans for how you want to describe those same extracts in other markets, right? Because the last thing you want to do is disclose your solvents here and raise questions in other markets for plaintiffs' lawyers who decide that your definition of your extract in those markets doesn't match up to their definition. Those can be costly mistakes. Even for something that lacks a legal definition today, in this space it may have one soon, and that legal definition may not perfectly track what the people in this room think it means, because again, it's coming from the legislature, it's coming from regulators. That's happened, for example, in the hemp space. In the hemp space, some markets have begun to regulate the use of the term broad or full spectrum, and they have defined it in ways that do not perfectly track the way that I think people in the industry use it. That obviously has significant implications if your brand is the full spectrum brand. I think that the other thing to consider is even beyond inputs, these terms can be defined in ways that you'll just want to be ahead of. About a week ago, the New York Cannabis Control Board had a hearing at which they indicated that they intend to regulate the term craft in the future. They did not say how they're going to regulate it, what it's going to mean to be a craft product, but let's say that you're planning to launch a product here, or you've launched a product here and you want to go to California. You want to partner with a large manufacturer in California because you don't want to go through the process of doing everything from scratch. You're going to license your recipe. Depending on how that term is defined, you may or may not be craft within the meaning of the New York rule. And if the New York rule is adopted in other places, you might be in trouble. So being mindful of where there are trends that these terms are starting to be defined like craft can be very valuable and important. What non-cannabinoid ingredients are you considering? What I will say is that there is increasing scrutiny paid in cannabis regulations to the form and sources of non-cannabinoid ingredients. Things like whether an additive is on the GRAS list, where did you purchase it? Now, why does that matter here? It particularly matters here because there are more eyeballs on this space from a regulatory perspective than there might be in other consumer products categories. So you might think, well, I see people use this additive for this purpose, even though it's only GRAS for this other purpose. That might not matter if you were making uninfused seltzers. In this space, it may well matter. You know, I think of when Bethany had the slide up, she was talking about flavors. Turmeric was one of them. If you've ever bought a supplement, just a regular supplement, non-cannabis, you may have seen people claim all sorts of interesting benefits for turmeric. I have no idea whether turmeric conveys those advantages, but I do know that there would be risk in making claims around turmeric and the health benefits of turmeric in cannabis like you might if you were selling a supplement. And that's where the opportunity comes, but it's also where the risk comes. It's just simply a different ballgame in cannabis than it would be if you're selling a soft drink, a juice, a seltzer, because of the number of eyes. I like to use this as just another fun example of something that you might not anticipate if you're not in the market. If you guys go to California with your products, in California you can't call your ingredients organic, even if they are organic. It's just not permitted by the regulators. They think it's going to confuse customers and believe that the overall product is organic, which isn't permitted under California law. So there's a cost-benefit trade-off. Do you switch your ingredients? Do you go to a cheaper ingredient? Or do you use the more expensive ingredient on the assumption that in the not-so-distant future you will be able to reveal that it is in fact, organic orange in your product? So I promised you I would talk about branding, and here it is. So the first bullet is pretty self-explanatory. If you're branding in this space, you have to figure out, to Bethany's point, what makes your product special? Who's your consumer? Why do they want your product and not some other product? This is no longer an industry where simply being on the shelf is going to mean that you're a winner, right? You need to have a differentiation. And this is your opportunity to connect. Even if it's something as simple as budget-conscious product, widely available product, something that consumers can trust they can find in every dispensary, it's crucial to be thinking about that from a regulatory standpoint from the jump, because risk can ripple in many unexpected ways in this space, particularly to a lay audience. Now, that sounds scary, but it has a flip side, which is when that risk takes your competitor off the shelf, the consumer is likely to turn to you. So there are opportunities here too, if you plan ahead, if you are well positioned. So how are you planning to position your product to consumers? I want to give two examples of areas of regulatory risk that line up with how people often position these. You need to be thinking about your launch states rules and expansion market rules and federal rules in the future, remembering that these rules are all going to be changing. That's why it's fun. That's why my job is fun. If final rules were actually final, I wouldn't have a job for very long, right? But it's about projecting where things are going. So what are things that might be core elements of your brand in state 1 that might not fly in state 2, and therefore you want to think about at the time you're developing state 1? Marketing perceived as promoting overconsumption is a classic. We're in the right place for it. It is prohibited here in Illinois. It's not actually in the rules in a lot of other states. We've always advised our clients to be thinking about it universally. Why is that? It goes right to the concerns that we hear when we talk to regulators. Regulators are worried about people promoting overconsumption of intoxicants. The folks who put on this show do a number of the leading trade shows in the alcohol space. They're fantastic shows. You should all attend. If you go to those, you will not find an alcohol product that the federal government permits to be sold in a way that seems like it's promoting overconsumption, saying, oh, go get drunk. That's just not a thing that you see in alcohol. Illinois is among the states that said you can't do that in cannabis either, but we've always told people that's coming, in our view. What's another one that you see a lot of? Wellness claims. And now this is the other side of what Bethany was talking about with need, marketing, and there's a huge opportunity, which is what she's pointing out. What I would say is, and you have to get it right, because it's easy to overstep on these, and then you lose your edge. You've built a bridge to a consumer, then you have to take that bridge away because the regulators say you can't do it. So what's the concern with wellness claims? Regulators have historically and still remain very concerned with untested medical claims. If you knew nothing of the regulators, you would probably guess they don't like untested medical claims. So what did people do in this industry? They saw the rules that said no medical claims without clear scientific proof, and they flipped them and they turned them into wellness claims. Now, those are better than medical claims, but there's risk, particularly in the hands of an unsophisticated marketer, that your wellness claim starts to look an awful lot like a medical claim. That means that states have increasingly started to regulate wellness claims also, because they saw this, and this is a dynamic game. They saw that folks were making these claims and they got concerned. The other thing that I'll point out, there's always a subjective discretionary authority for regulators in the rules. Our clients, particularly new clients, often show us art from a branding firm, and we have to explain that we can see X, Y, or Z in it, even if that wasn't what was intended, right? It's about understanding how a regulator, who's going to have a different set of life experiences, background, training than you all, might look at something, right? These people go into this job as a public service. They care deeply about public safety. They often don't have a number of years experience in CPG. They're coming at it from a public health or a public safety perspective. Looking at these through their eyes is important because you don't want to try to explain to them, no, that's not what I meant. They'll see what they see in it. Of course, even if you subsequently convince them that you were in the right, that they don't reimburse you for those costs. So it's helpful to have a plan, an explanation, and to avoid unnecessary risk on this one. One of my favorites, Nevada put out a piece of advertising guidance earlier this year that included the warning to keep advertising respectful and tasteful. That's how it closed. And I think that that's a good reminder, right? That wasn't something in the rules. They just wanted people to keep it respectful because they don't want an industry that looks like it's appealing to inappropriate urges. So how are you planning to reach consumers then? I've heard the real idea from a potential customer of ours to hire influencers who were 19 to push messaging. It wasn't that they said, oh, I'm going to hire these 19-year-olds, but when I asked who these people were, because I was clearly not in the demo, I did not know who the person was. A quick Google search revealed to me this person was 19. That's illegal under the subjective rules of most states, right? You can't market in a way that's perceived as targeting minors. But most states also just have a rule that says you can't put a minor in your marketing. And so that one, subjective rule, objective rule, failed both ways. You want to be smart, you want to have a plan here, I think is the takeaway. Now that may mean that you're thinking about something like billboards. Billboards work in some states, they don't work in other states. California is a great example of this. If any of you have been to California, you've probably seen cannabis billboards. They can be in certain highways and not in other highways. And there was a rule that permitted them to be on more highways that a court struck down about a year ago. And so the legislature passed a law that was going to take the market back to the old rule. You're going to be able to put them in the same places. And then about a month ago, the governor vetoed that bill. So it's a very dynamic process. And if your business model is all about, well, we're going to put billboards up here, 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 billboards, because of the fact that they're physical structures, also have local rules, very complex. Upshot again, have a plan, and if you're relying on billboard marketing, make sure that you can actually do what you want. The fourth bullet, how do you message consistently across target markets? This is a tricky one because these are each siloed markets, right? So you need to have a branding that works and makes sense across them. It's one thing if you have a seasonal brand, maybe it makes sense to message about the virtues of California sun-grown product in California and then Illinois local product here. That could work, but it depends on how you branded it. A good example, actual consumption and marketing. There are a ton of different rules around whether or not you can show consumption in your marketing that draw the line in different places. Some states don't have any rule. They say you can show consumption in your marketing, but a lot of them say no depiction of actual consumption or no depiction of consumption, period. So it doesn't need to be actual, right? Some states say actual consumption, some say consumption, which is broader. And if you think about it, picture in your head, what would be the moment at which a beverage is being consumed, right? Is it somebody swallowing it? Is it holding it? Is it holding it near your mouth? These are the questions that you want to be thinking about, really when you take the art. Because if you want to use the same art in multiple markets, or the same models with different cans so that they have the right state graphics on it, it's helpful to do that up front and know what you can do with these to recreate the same brand iconography. Again, key takeaway, think about the differences in the rules in each market where you want to message because it's going to impact your core business strategy. Packaging and labeling, this is how your product is going to stand out on the shelf, but one question is which shelf, right? A product for a consumption lounge needs to look cool while somebody holds it for an extended period, right? The shelf is really the other guy's hand. At a minimum, what I always say about drinks and why this is such a cool segment, and why even though it's 2% of the market today, people believe it will be a big part of the market going forward, is that you can look very cool holding a drink for an extended period of time. That's an oversimplification, but in a world of social consumption lounges, you guys selling drinks have an advantage that, say, the gummy manufacturer doesn't have. I may be wrong, maybe somebody in this room can do it, but I've never seen anyone who can look really cool eating a gummy for 30 minutes, right? Just in the same way that you would over a drink, right? Taking a sip, this has a social meaning to all of us, thanks to many, many years of people meeting for drinks. So that's an advantage you have, and your product has the flexibility that others don't. So the question is then, how do you design around that flexibility to best leverage it if you want to be the social consumption lounge drink? You want to think about your target markets. Again, assuming you want roughly consistent visual appeal, because you'll have a different universal symbol in different markets, things like opacity. Most edibles are required to be in opaque packaging. California just changed the rules just for beverages, not for other types of edibles, to make those more liberal, more flexible. But do you want to take advantage of that flexibility if you can't do it in other markets? Same thing with child resistance options. More flexibility in a market like California to meet the standard in other ways, but you may not be able to sell the same bottle then or can here. Also think about how consumers can interact with your product prior to purchase. Is it behind glass? Can they pick it up? Can they look at it? That's going to impact the size of the font you want to use, font sizes, information on the label, all going to be governed by the rules. And so you'll want to be thinking about how you stitch this all together so that somebody sees your product here, or they see it in California and they go, ah, this is brand X, I know what this is. And then quickly, what's your game plan? Who do you have leading strategy on these points? It is very important to have the right kitchen cabinet on this stuff in cannabis. You want to have the right kitchen cabinet on reaching the target demo, but you also need to be thinking about who's projecting where the federal government is going to be for you. How have you vetted your team, your collaborators, especially as you scale? This is something we see a lot. As you grow in this space, it is very easy to have somebody who can do harm to your brand that you've so carefully built by saying something dumb in marketing, on social media, whatever it may be. Have a plan, vet them, put in place the checks and balances that you need. What have you told your investors? This is the Massachusetts example that's come back to life. If you've said we're going to do great in Massachusetts with our multi-serving beverage, you're going to have to walk that back, right? It's that times a million. It's knowing what you can promise and what you shouldn't promise. And then how strong is your compliance team? I feel like that's a logical place to end this. Things like social media. Who's monitoring that? Who is in charge of making sure that risk doesn't leak out for your brand that you're building? Because that's the last thing, obviously, that folks like you need. Your sales team. I always think back to False Claims Act cases, because that's what I used to defend. Those are the pharmaceutical cases. They can be very expensive that the federal government prosecutes. How do you make sure that your sales team isn't selling your product in a way that they shouldn't be? And the example I use here, in Colorado, there was a sting a number of years ago where they called up dispensaries and pretended to be pregnant women and said they had morning sickness and asked if they could get a product recommendation. Now, the answer should have been no. All of the products sold in these dispensaries have a warning that say not for use by pregnant women. Around 70% of the dispensaries said, I have just the thing for you, right? These were people trying to be helpful, and I'm sure they thought that they were helping. But there needs to be a message to the folks at the front line who are then representing your brand to make sure that they're not doing harm, right? That they're doing what you want, because ultimately it's your brand on the line. So that's not me, but this is. So I'll leave it there. Rachel, I think I'm out of time, correct? All right, well, thank you so much. Hopefully.